we have a very interesting conversation where I might learn a couple of things. It's with Ian Fletcher. He's an adjunct fellow for the U.S. Business and Industry Council. He's also the author of Free Trade Doesn't Work, What Should Replace It, and Why? And he actually just wrote The Mythical Concept of Trade War, an article that I want to talk about as well. Ian, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me on. You guys put on a great show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Ian, I need to get educated on this stuff a little bit here. Now, there's the very rough camps of free trade and fair trade. The free trade guys say no tariffs, no restrictions. The fair trade guys say, hey, we have to have equivalent rules. If we're going to do trade with China, they have to have the same environmental rules, labor rules, etc. That's my rough understanding, right? First of all, is that right? Second of all, where do you fall in that camp?
Well, there's really two different senses of the term fair trade. The first that everyone's familiar with is in the sense of fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate that you can buy at the nice supermarkets nowadays. That basically means that some nice do-gooding people have set up a trading arrangement to make sure that the farmers in the poor tropical countries where these products are actually grown get a reasonable share of the profits from selling these products. That's a good thing. The more important sense of fair trade refers to the fact that it's a lot easier to export a car from Japan to the United States than vice versa, and cars is just the beginning. The trading arrangements around the world are systematically rigged by governments to favor various interests, and the United States has, for the last generation or so, been on the short end of this.
But we also do our own set of subsidies, et cetera, right? I mean, don't we have tremendous subsidies for corn that other countries don't necessarily have, and that gives us an advantage?
Not really. The first thing you have to understand is that trade in agricultural products is a small percentage of overall trade between developed countries. The only countries where agricultural products are a big share of the economy are third world countries. That's the first point. The second point is that U.S. agricultural subsidies are kind of bizarre, but they're not nearly as bizarre as what they have in Europe. And if you go to Japan, they're science fiction.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
What I mean is, Japanese agricultural subsidies, the Japanese grow rice on tiny plots of land that nobody would use in the rice-growing areas of the United States, like Louisiana, because Japan is a highly urbanized society, and most of their empty land is mountainous anyway, but they continue to support rice for complicated reasons having to do with Japanese culture and politics and so forth.
Okay.
So it's incredibly subsidized. I mean, when you buy rice in Tokyo, you're mostly eating government subsidy.
So am I right in saying that you don't think that there's any such thing as free trade anyway? I mean, it depends on whose perspective you look at it from. So if we don't do tariffs on China, okay, we call it free trade, but it's not really free trade because China's doing tariffs on us. Is that right?
Yes and no. The first thing you have to understand is that when I use the term free trade, I don't literally mean the perfect 100% pure, nitpickingly, pedantically accurate free trade that one could insist upon if one were sitting at a chalkboard in a classroom. Imports into the United States are about 99% free, to be perfectly honest. I base that figure on the fact that U.S. tariffs are roughly 1% of U.S. imports, but 99% free is free for all practical purposes. The larger point that you've made is that trade in the opposite direction, exports for the United States to foreign countries, is not even close to 99% free, which is why we have this terrible trade imbalance of the U.S. importing more than it exports to the tune of several $100 billion a year.
Right. Now, people say that we can't really fix that because it'll start a trade war, and that if we raise tariffs, then other countries will raise their tariffs. Why do you think that's wrong?
Well, the first thing you have to remember is that we're the ones running the deficit, and foreign nations are the ones running the surpluses against it. So they have much more to lose than we do if they want to start a trade war. So the deck is actually stacked against them, and our present position of weakness is actually a position of strength. That's reason number one. Reason number two is if you look at nations like China, which are running a huge trade huge trade surplus against the United States, they know perfectly well that the surplus cannot go on forever. In fact, it's probably going to die at some point in the next 5 years or so. As a result, when the United States is talking about changing the world trading regime so that either we buy less from them or they buy more from us, that's going to bring to an end a really sweet deal that they know, whether they want to say this in public or not, they know is going to come to an end anyway. So the choice they're facing is not whether they give up their trade surplus with the United States or not. The question is whether it goes away in a nice, orderly, negotiated fashion between our government and theirs, or whether they run the risk of heading for a sudden debacle the way we had a financial debacle in 2008. So there are good reasons for them to end this trade surplus the nice way rather than the nasty way.
Ian, you know, and we're talking to Ian Fletcher here. His book is Free Trade Doesn't Work, What Should Replace It and Why? That leads me to a natural question of, okay, how much would you raise the tariffs? Because there's got to be some limit to it, in which case you would really start a chain reaction of people raising tariffs all over the world, which doesn't really help anybody, I don't think.
Well, I say in my book that what I would do is I would just go back to the Teddy Roosevelt era of the United States being a tariff-protected economy, which is what the U.S. was pretty much from the American Revolution to the end of World War II. I suggest in the book a flat tariff, the same for all products, so that there's no political mischief, of, say, 25 or 30%. If you look at America's history, that's in line with historical precedents. And if you look at various estimates you can make at how much world trade is distorted by foreign nations and how much it would take to put a thumb on the other side of the scale to bring it back into balance, that's also a plausible figure. But I'm not nitpickingly exact about that. Obviously, that would be something that would be negotiated on the floor of Congress if they ever did that.
Wouldn't it be more ideal if instead of us going to 25 to 30%, if we can get everybody else to go down to 1%?
The problem is the United States has been trying to get other nations to cut. It's not just tariffs, it's non-tariff barriers, some of which are invisible because they simply consist in behind-the-scenes understandings between foreign governments and foreign corporations that you just don't import American goods if you know what's good for you. And sometimes it's understandings between the major banks in foreign countries. For example, in Japan and Germany, the economy is controlled through the banks, which own big chunks of the debt of the major corporations, and people are just told don't import if you know what's good for you. As a result, it's very hard to chip away at the trade barriers of foreign nations, let alone negotiate them away. I mean, we've been trying to do that since Bill Clinton was in office, and it hasn't worked. So, I mean,
Okay.
that's how much longer do we have to go on with that strategy before we learn our lesson?
All right, so you don't think it's practical. But, okay, so if we have the higher tariffs, though, we're all agreed that we're going to have higher prices for us in consumer goods.
Yes and no. The first thing you have to remember is if you put in, say, a 25% tariff on all imports, then if you want to buy a flat-screen TV made in Japan, it's going to cost 25% more. But you don't have to buy the imported model. You can buy an American TV, actually not for flat screens because those aren't made in the U.S. anymore. That's in itself a danger sign, and we'd like to relocate that industry back to the U.S. But if you don't want to pay a 25% tariff to buy a Toyota, buy a Chevy instead. That's point number one. Point number two is when you have a tariff and you collect hundreds of billions of dollars in tariff revenue, you can rebate that to the income tax. You could finance a big cut in income tax with the tariff revenue that you would get. And that's what I suggest in my book because I'm neutral about what the overall level of taxation should be. The issue for me is not how much we tax, which is a legitimate argument between liberals and conservatives. The issue is what we tax. I think we should not tax income so much and start taxing imports instead.
You're with the U.S. Business and Industry Council.
Yes, that's a Washington-based think tank founded in 1933. I run the California office, which is in San Francisco.
Right, but do you guys have a motivation to increase the tariffs of foreign companies and so that U.S. companies do better competitively?
That's part of the picture. Obviously, a lot of our membership is hurting from foreign unfair trade practices, and it is destroying jobs in the United States. So, sure, that's definitely part of what we're about.
Yeah, you know, all right, but you said at the end of World War II, we had high tariffs until the end of World War II. But, Ian, when I look at what happened historically, we had this enormous boom after the end of World War II. So is that correlated? We get rid of the tariffs and then we have this incredibly strong economy for about 50 years?
Well, what happened is when we started cutting our tariffs at the end of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, this was largely a Cold War strategy to fight communism by helping other nations through exports to the U.S. and binding them to the United States. We had, at that time, overwhelming technological and economic superiority over the rest of the world. So we could afford to indulge free trade for, 15 or 20 years after 1945. The problem is that that position of superiority, which was an historical accident, did not last forever, and increasingly after the mid-1960s, as foreign nations caught up with us, it started to matter their unfair trading practices, their mercantilist aggressiveness against the United States, and those chickens are coming home to roost right now.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. I'm not convinced of that. I think that it's not necessarily a coincidence that we had the boom afterwards. And I'll tell you another concern I have, which is that I don't think protectionism is going to work. If they produce goods cheaper somewhere else, yeah, we can raise our tariffs all day long, but if we don't produce stuff that's either good enough or cheap enough, the rest of the world isn't going to buy it, and it's just a vicious cycle. I don't see that working in the long run.
You're correct, but that's actually why I disagree with you. One of the points I make in my book is if you had, say, a 30% flat tariff, you're not going to relocate back to the United States industries like the production of T-shirts, which are mostly based on cheap labor. That's fine. We don't want to capture those industries because they don't pay the kind of wages it takes to live in a developed country, and there are also the low innovation industries that don't have a future. But you would tend to relocate back to the United States industries, as I mentioned before, like the production of flat panel televisions, which are important because those are the high-tech, high-value industries that not only pay high wages but have a future in innovation.
And just before we let you go, I really, of course, that so depends on the numbers and how you interpret the numbers. I'm left a little unconvinced, but I hear your argument, and I think it's, of course, a perfectly acceptable argument, and it's an interesting one to have. NAFTA, just can you real quick tell me what your main issue with NAFTA was and why you didn't think it was the right way to go?
I don't think NAFTA ever should have been signed. I think that it's been a disaster for both the United States and Mexico. The United States lost a lot of jobs to Mexico, and now Mexico is losing jobs to China, so it hasn't really worked out well for any of the countries involved. I mean, Ross Perot's kind of a kook, but I think he was right.
Yeah, but weren't those, see, I'm sympathetic to that, but I think if you have lower wages in Mexico, aren't the jobs of manufacturing things obviously going to migrate down to Mexico one way or another?
To some extent they will, and as I point out in the book, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are industries that the United States should be shedding and transferring abroad. For example, the manufacture of T-shirts is not a good industry to have Americans working in because it's a cheap labor industry, a low-skill industry that doesn't pay the kind of wages that it takes to live in a developed country. It also has no future because there's no innovation in the manufacture of T-shirts. So yes, those kind of junk industries, they should go abroad, and they will. The problem is that if you look at the facts, and I talk about this for a couple of chapters in my book, the U.S. is not just losing bad industries, it's also losing good industries, high-tech industries, the kind of industries we need to have in this country if we're to have an economic future.
But I think that, I hear you, but I think India and China are going to grab those anyway. I mean, they have a pretty good education system in certain areas of those countries for sure, and so they have the high-tech thing, and it's lower wage. You're fighting a losing battle. It doesn't, I mean, you can tariff.
Well, if what you're saying is true, then the United States is finished, and the United States is going to end up with wages the same as India and China. Any of your listeners who want to volunteer for that, raise your hands.
No. First of all, it doesn't mean we're finished, and it doesn't mean we go down to India's prices. In fact, I was just talking over the weekend with some friends, and China's wages are going significantly up now. You reach an equilibrium. And as much as we want to fight that, I think that's just a natural law of economics.
None of this is inevitable. One of the things I document in my book at length is how much of all these realities are controlled by specific government policies. For example, when China undervalues its currency by 40%, that means that whatever their wages are, whatever their productivity is, they take that, and then on top of that, there's a state-generated artificial advantage of 40% in competing with American industries. This is not some beautiful free market equilibrium. It just isn't.
No, Ian, you're definitely right about that, and that's why I don't think it's a black or white issue. I think we need to be more nuanced on this and say, look, if they're going to do that and they have a 30% advantage, then we have a right to say, all right, well, until you change that, then we're going to do 30% on our end. I think that's a fair negotiation. It's not either, okay, they're doing it and we can't do anything about it and we have to yell free trade, or we're going to, absolutely do a 30% tariff no matter what they're doing, right? I think that should be a back and forth.
Okay, your position makes a lot more sense than what America's government has been doing for the last 15 years. The drawback is that if we call China's bluff and say, okay, sport, you need to end your subsidies, your mercantilism, your currency manipulation, your slave labor, all the things you do to game the system, otherwise you're facing a tariff. What do we do if they say no? You see, we need, at an absolute minimum, contingency plans to function as a tariff-protected economy. Otherwise, our threats will be hollow, and they will know that.
I think we've got to come to a middle ground where we're a lot tougher in negotiating these trade pacts so that they don't have these uneven advantages. But at the same time, I don't think we go all the way to tariffs instantly. But yes, you have to have that option. There's, when it comes to war, they love to have all the options on the table. And when it comes to trade, I hear you that we should have more options on the table. So that's something we can certainly
I'm very glad that you appear to grasp that we need at least the option of being able to function as a tariff-protected economy, even if what you believe in is free trade, because we need a credible threat.
There you go. Ian Fletcher's book is Free Trade Doesn't Work, What Should Replace It and Why. Thank you so much for coming on and having this interesting conversation.
Thank you very much. You put on a great show.
Thank you.